The fog that clung to London streets on that October morning of 1892 seemed to mirror the obscurity that would soon envelop one of the most perplexing cases in my long association with Sherlock Holmes. I had risen early, drawn by the crisp autumn air and the promise of a brisk walk through the awakening city, only to find my friend already ensconced in his chair, pipe in hand, studying a telegram with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient scripture. "Ah, Watson," he said without lifting his eyes from the yellow paper, "your timing is impeccable. We have been summoned to witness what Scotland Yard believes to be a simple case of abduction, but which I suspect harbours depths far more treacherous than the Thames at low tide." I poured myself coffee from the service Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided and settled into my customary chair. "What manner of case, Holmes?" "The vanishing of two men from a tailor's shop in Brewer Street. The circumstances are most peculiar." He finally looked up, his grey eyes alight with that familiar gleam that preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Mr. Reginald Pemberton, a wealthy importer of fine goods, arrived at Hartwell and Sons Tailoring at precisely 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon for a scheduled fitting. The shop's proprietor, one Edmund Hartwell, was alone at the time, his assistant having departed earlier due to illness. Holmes rose and began his familiar pacing before the fireplace. At 10 minutes past 3, Mrs. Agnes Whitmore, the proprietress of the millinery shop adjacent, heard the bell of Hartwell's establishment ring, indicating someone's departure. Yet when she glanced through her window, a habit she freely admits to, she saw no one emerging from the shop. Curious, she continued her observations. And what did she observe? Nothing, Watson. Absolutely nothing. No further movement, no sound, no sign of life. By 4 o'clock, growing concerned about the unusual silence, for Mr. Hartwell was known to be quite vocal during fittings, she ventured to investigate. She found the shop's door locked from the inside, the closed sign displayed, yet she could see through the window that a tea service remained on the counter, steam still rising from the pot. I leaned forward, intrigued. And the police? Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour, accompanied by a locksmith. They found the shop empty of human occupants, but undisturbed in every other respect. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. The tea was indeed still warm. Mr. Pemberton's coat hung neatly on the hook by the door, and his walking stick rested against the counter. Most significantly, the shop's rear door, which opens onto a narrow alley, was securely bolted from within. "A locked room mystery," I murmured. "But surely there must be some explanation." "Indeed there must," Holmes interrupted, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Which is why we shall examine the scene ourselves, before the Yard's heavy-handed approach obliterates any subtle clues that might remain." Within the hour, we found ourselves standing before the modest frontage of Hartwell and Sons on Brewer Street. The shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian building, its windows displaying bolts of fine cloth and a few completed garments. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, kept at bay by a constable whose red face suggested he had been dealing with their questions for some time. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with his characteristic mixture of relief and resignation. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I confess myself baffled. In 20 years of police work, I've never encountered anything quite like this. Describe the scene exactly as you found it," Holmes commanded, producing his magnifying glass. "The front door was locked, key turned from inside. We had to break in through the back after the locksmith failed to manage the front lock. It's a complex mechanism, apparently installed recently. Inside, everything appeared normal, the tea service on the counter still warm. Mr. Pemberton's coat and stick where I mentioned. The fitting room curtain drawn closed, but empty within." Holmes moved through the shop with the precision of a bloodhound, examining every surface, every corner. I watched him pause at the counter where the tea service sat, bend to examine the floor beneath the cutting table, and spend several minutes studying the lock mechanism of the front door. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Watson, observe the dust patterns on these fabric bolts. What do you make of them?" I studied the shelves carefully. Some appear to have been recently disturbed, while others show accumulations of dust, suggesting they haven't been touched in weeks. Precisely. And here, at the cutting table, note the arrangement of the tools. The large shears are positioned for a left-handed person, yet the tape measure and chalk are arranged for right-handed use. Lestrade frowned. What significance could that have? Perhaps none, perhaps everything. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Mr. Hartwell's personal circumstances?" "Respectable businessman, well regarded in the trade. Unmarried, lived alone in rooms above the shop. No known debts or enemies. The shop's been in his family for 30 years. And Mr. Pemberton? Wealthy importer, as I mentioned. Married, 2 children, excellent reputation. He'd been a customer here for 5 years, always prompt with payments. No apparent connection to Hartwell beyond the business relationship. Holmes moved to the narrow staircase that led to the upper floors. These rooms above, you've searched them?" "Thoroughly. Hartwell's private quarters on the first floor, storage on the second. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing that we could determine." "Nothing missing that you could determine," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "An important distinction, Inspector." I followed Holmes up the stairs, noting the meticulous order of Hartwell's living quarters. The rooms were spartanly furnished but clean, with evidence of a man who lived alone but maintained high standards. Holmes spent considerable time examining a small desk by the window, pulling out drawers and studying their contents. "Watson, look at this." He held up a leather-bound appointment book. "See here, Pemberton's appointment is noted for 3 o'clock, but observe the entry for 2 weeks previous." I examined the page. Another appointment, but the name has been carefully erased. "Indeed, and look at the pattern of appointments over the past 6 months. Notice anything unusual?" I studied the entries more carefully. There seemed to be 2 distinct types of appointments. Some are clearly routine fittings, marked with specific measurements and fabric choices, but others— I paused, seeing the pattern. Others are simply initials and times, with no additional notes. Excellent observation. And what might you deduce about the nature of these mysterious appointments? Before I could answer, we heard Lestrade's voice from below, urgent and excited. "Mr. Holmes, you need to see this immediately." We descended rapidly to find the inspector standing beside the cutting table, holding what appeared to be a small piece of paper. His face was flushed with excitement. This was wedged beneath the table leg, nearly invisible. We missed it in our initial search. Holmes took the paper with his tweezers, examining it carefully. It was a fragment, apparently torn from a larger sheet, with only a few words visible. "The Blackwood matter must not—" and below that, in different handwriting, "Payment as agreed." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "And you found nothing else?" "Nothing, sir. But this suggests some sort of business arrangement beyond simple tailoring." Holmes pocketed the fragment. "Indeed it does. Inspector, I shall need to examine Mr. Hartwell's business records in detail. Also, I require information about any other clients who might have had these mysterious appointments, particularly anyone whose name begins with B for Blackwood." As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the shop's window, studying the street beyond. "Watson, observe the sight lines from the neighboring shops. Mrs. Whitmore's millinery provides an excellent view of this entrance. But what of the other establishments?" I followed his gaze. "The baker's shop across the street would have a clear view, and that bookshop on the corner." "Precisely. Yet none of their proprietors reported seeing anything unusual. Most curious for such a busy street during the afternoon hours." As we stepped back onto Brewer Street, Holmes turned to me with an expression I had learned to recognize: the look of a man who had seen through the surface of things to the machinery beneath. "Watson, we are not dealing with a simple abduction. The evidence suggests something far more complex, a web of secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect." "Kill?" I asked, startled. "But there's no evidence of violence." "Isn't there?" Holmes smiled grimly. "Two men enter a locked room and vanish without a trace, leaving behind only the suggestion of mysterious business dealings and a fragmentary note about payment. In my experience, such circumstances rarely involve voluntary disappearances." "But where are the bodies?" "An excellent question, my dear fellow, one that I suspect will lead us into the darker corners of London's commercial underworld." As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes continued his analysis. "Consider the facts. A tailor's shop that receives mysterious appointments, a recent change in the lock mechanism, the careful arrangement of tools suggesting multiple users, and the selective disturbance of stock. This was no simple tailoring establishment, Watson. It was a front for something far more dangerous." "What sort of front?" "That remains to be determined, but I suspect Mr. Hartwell was involved in activities that required the utmost discretion, the kind that wealthy men like Pemberton might pay handsomely to keep secret." We had reached Baker Street when Holmes suddenly stopped, his attention caught by something across the road. "Watson, do you see that gentleman in the dark coat standing by the lamp-post?" I looked, but saw only the usual pedestrians going about their business. "Which gentleman?" "He's gone now, but he's been following us since we left Brewer Street. A tall man, well-dressed, with a distinctive limp favouring his left leg." "Are you certain?" "Quite certain. And his interest in our activities suggests that word of our involvement has already reached interested parties. We must proceed with extreme caution, Watson. I fear we have stumbled upon something that reaches into the highest levels of society, and those involved will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." As we climbed the stairs to our lodgings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had indeed crossed a threshold into dangerous territory. The mystery of the vanishing tailor was only the beginning, and already I sensed that before this case was concluded, we would face perils that might test even Holmes's remarkable abilities. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with the news that a message had arrived in our absence. Holmes examined the envelope carefully before opening it, noting the expensive paper and the absence of a return address. "Most interesting," he murmured as he read. "It appears, Watson, that we have attracted the attention of someone who claims to have information about the Blackwood matter. They request a meeting tonight at the Criterion restaurant, table 12, at 8 o'clock. It could be a trap." "Undoubtedly. But it could also be our first real lead. We shall attend, but with appropriate precautions." As the afternoon wore on, Holmes threw himself into research, sending Billy on various errands and consulting his extensive files on London's criminal underworld. I found myself growing increasingly uneasy, sensing that we were being drawn into a web of intrigue that might prove more deadly than any we had previously encountered. The shadows were lengthening when Holmes finally looked up from his work, his expression grave. "Watson, I have uncovered some disturbing information about our missing tailor. It appears that Edmund Hartwell was not the simple craftsman he appeared to be. According to my sources, he was known in certain circles as a man who could provide very special services that went far beyond the mere fitting of clothes." "What sort of services?" "The kind that allow a man to become someone else entirely. New identities, false papers, the complete transformation of appearance and circumstance. In short, Watson, our tailor was in the business of making men disappear, and I suspect that he himself has now fallen victim to his own dangerous trade." The revelation sent a chill through me as I contemplated the implications. If Holmes was correct, then we were not merely investigating a disappearance, but a murder, and the killer was someone with access to the highest levels of society, someone who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As night fell over London, We prepared for our meeting at the Criterion, both of us acutely aware that we might be walking into a trap that could cost us our lives. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, but this time the stakes were higher than ever before. The Criterion restaurant buzzed with the usual evening crowd when Holmes and I arrived precisely at 8 o'clock. The establishment, with its gilt mouldings and crystal chandeliers, represented the epitome of London's fashionable dining. Yet tonight, it felt charged with an undercurrent of danger that set my nerves on edge. Table 12 sat in a corner alcove, partially screened by a decorative palm. Holmes had insisted we arrive early to observe the approaches, and we had spent the previous quarter hour studying the clientele from a discreet distance. As we approached our designated table, I noticed that Holmes's hand rested casually near his coat pocket, where I knew he kept his revolver. "Gentlemen," a voice called softly from the shadows of the alcove, "I trust you are Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson?" The speaker was a woman of perhaps 40 years, elegantly dressed in dark blue silk, her face partially concealed by a fashionable hat with a small veil. She gestured for us to sit, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she did so. "I am Mrs. Victoria Blackwood," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe you have found reference to my family name in connection with the unfortunate events on Brewer Street." Holmes settled into his chair with characteristic composure. "Indeed we have, Mrs. Blackwood, though I confess I am somewhat surprised to find that the mysterious Blackwood matter involves a lady of evident refinement." She smiled bitterly. "Refinement, Mr. Holmes, is often a mask for the most sordid of necessities. I come to you not by choice, but because I fear that Edmund Hartwell's disappearance may be connected to services he provided for my family, services that, if exposed, would destroy us utterly." I leaned forward, intrigued despite my caution. "What manner of services?" Mrs. Blackwood glanced around nervously before continuing. "My husband, Sir Charles Blackwood, is a member of Parliament with aspirations to high office. 3 years ago, he became involved in certain financial irregularities. Nothing criminal, you understand, but sufficient to end his political career, should they become public knowledge. And Mr. Hartwell assisted in concealing these irregularities?" Holmes asked. "Not concealing, Mr. Holmes, transforming. You see, my husband had accumulated substantial debts through unwise investments. To satisfy his creditors without destroying his reputation, he arranged for the creation of a false identity, one that would allow him to conduct business dealings without any connection to his public persona." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And Hartwell provided this false identity?" "Yes, complete with documentation, a manufactured history, and even physical alterations to his appearance when conducting business under this assumed name. The arrangement worked perfectly for nearly 2 years until, I prompted. Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Until someone began threatening to expose the deception. We received a series of anonymous letters, each demanding increasingly large sums of money to maintain silence. The latest demanded £10,000, a sum that would bankrupt us even if we could raise it." Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "And you believe this blackmailer is connected to Hartwell's disappearance?" "I'm certain of it. The final letter arrived the morning before Mr. Hartwell vanished. It stated that if payment was not made within 24 hours, evidence of Charles's double identity would be delivered to the Times." "Do you have this letter?" Mrs. Blackwood reached into her reticule and produced a folded sheet of paper. Holmes examined it carefully, holding it up to the light from the chandelier. "Expensive paper," he murmured. "Watermarked. The handwriting is educated, possibly disguised. Most interesting. See here, Watson, the impression of previous writing on the sheet." I examined the paper but could make out only faint marks. "What does it say?" "It appears to be an address, something ending in Muse." "Mrs. Blackwood, Has your husband any connection to properties in the Mews districts? None that I'm aware of. But, Mr. Holmes, there's something else you should know. My husband received an urgent message yesterday afternoon, just before Mr. Hartwell's disappearance was discovered. He left the house immediately and hasn't returned. The implications struck me like a physical blow. You think he went to meet Hartwell? I don't know what to think. Charles has been acting strangely for weeks, secretive and nervous. When I learned of the disappearance, I feared the worst. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together. Mrs. Blackwood, I must ask you directly, do you believe your husband capable of violence? She recoiled as if struck. Violence? Charles is many things, Mr. Holmes, but he is not a violent man. He is weak, perhaps, and foolish in his ambitions, but he could never harm another person. Yet desperate men often act in ways that surprise even those closest to them, Holmes observed quietly. Tell me, what was the nature of your husband's financial troubles? You mentioned unwise investments. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, then seemed to steel herself. Charles became involved with a group of investors who claimed to have exclusive access to certain colonial opportunities. They convinced him to invest not only his own money, but funds that he had been entrusted to manage for his constituents' benefit. Embezzlement, I said quietly. Not intentionally. Charles genuinely believed the investments would prove profitable, allowing him to return the funds with handsome profits for all involved. Instead, the entire scheme collapsed, taking with it nearly £15,000 of public money. Holmes absorbed this information with his characteristic calm. And the false identity allowed him to engage in business dealings to recoup these losses? Yes, but even those ventures have proved largely unsuccessful. We are, Mr. Holmes, a family tottering on the edge of ruin, which makes the blackmail demands all the more devastating, Holmes observed. Mrs. Blackwood, I must see these anonymous letters, all of them. She produced a small bundle from her reticule. I've brought them all. The first arrived 6 months ago, demanding only £50. Each subsequent letter increased the amount. Holmes spread the letters on the table, studying them with his magnifying glass. Watson observed the progression of handwriting across these letters. What do you notice? I examined them carefully. The early letters appear to be written by someone taking great care to disguise their natural hand, but the later ones— I paused, seeing the pattern. The later ones show increasing carelessness, as if the writer was becoming more confident or perhaps more desperate. Excellent observation. And notice this. The paper stock changes with the fourth letter. The watermark is different, suggesting our blackmailer was forced to purchase stationery from a different source. What does that signify? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything, but it suggests someone whose usual suppliers were temporarily unavailable, possibly because they were traveling or had relocated. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward anxiously. Mr. Holmes, can you help us? I fear that Charles may have done something foolish in his desperation to protect our family. Before Holmes could respond, I noticed a commotion near the restaurant's entrance. A tall man in a dark coat was engaged in heated conversation with the maitre d', gesticulating urgently. As he turned, I caught sight of his profile and realized with a start that he was the same individual Holmes had observed following us earlier. Holmes, I said quietly, our friend from this afternoon has arrived. Holmes followed my gaze, and his expression hardened. Mrs. Blackwood, I fear this meeting may not be as private as we hoped. Do you recognize that gentleman? She turned to look and immediately gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Dear God, it's Inspector Morrison from the Metropolitan Police. What is he doing here? Inspector Morrison? Holmes's voice carried a note of sharp interest. Not connected to this case, surely? No, but he's been investigating Charles's financial affairs for weeks. If he sees us together— She rose abruptly. I must go. Mr. Holmes, please, find Charles before something terrible happens. Before either of us could stop her, Mrs. Blackwood had gathered her things and slipped away through the crowd, leaving us alone with the approaching inspector. Morrison reached our table within moments, his face flushed with apparent urgency. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, what extraordinary luck finding you here. I've been searching for you all evening." "Indeed, Inspector. And what matter requires such urgent attention?" "The Brewer Street case has taken a decidedly serious turn. We've found evidence of foul play. Bloodstains in the alley behind Hartwell's shop. Carefully cleaned, but still detectable to modern methods. More importantly, we've discovered that Mr. Pemberton was not the respectable businessman we initially believed." Holmes's expression remained neutral. "Indeed, what have you discovered?" Pemberton was operating under a false identity. His real name was Peter Whitmore, and he was wanted in connection with a series of fraudulent investment schemes that bilked investors out of nearly £50,000. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whitmore? But that's the name of the milliner next door to Hartwell's shop. "Precisely, Doctor. Mrs. Agnes Whitmore is his wife, and she has been complicit in his schemes from the beginning. The entire scenario, her observation of the empty shop, her concerned investigation, was an elaborate performance designed to establish an alibi." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "And what do you believe actually occurred?" "We believe Whitmore, or Pemberton, as he was calling himself, went to Hartwell's shop not for a fitting, but to silence him permanently. Hartwell had been providing false identities for criminals and was becoming a liability. Whitmore killed him, disposed of the body, and then used Hartwell's own expertise to create a new identity for himself." "But the locked room," I began. "Easily explained once you understand the true nature of the business. Hartwell had installed a complex lock mechanism, not for security, but to provide the impression of impossible circumstances. The lock could be manipulated from outside using a specialized tool, one that we found hidden in Mrs. Whitmore's millinery shop." Holmes absorbed this information with apparent calm, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "And where do you believe Whitmore is now?" "Fled to the continent, most likely. But we'll catch him. The important thing is that we've solved the mystery of the vanishing Tailor." "Have you indeed?" Holmes's voice carried a note of skepticism. "Tell me, Inspector, what evidence do you have that Whitmore actually killed Hartwell, rather than simply disappearing with him?" Morrison hesitated. "The bloodstains I mentioned could have come from any number of sources. A cut finger, a nosebleed, even animal blood used to create a false impression. Have you found a body?" "Not yet, but then I suggest your case is far from closed." Holmes rose from his chair. "Inspector, I appreciate your sharing this information, but I fear you may be pursuing shadows while the real culprit escapes justice." As we left the Criterion, I could see that Holmes was deep in thought, his mind working to assimilate the evening's revelations. "Holmes," I said as we walked toward Baker Street, "do you believe Morrison's theory?" "I believe it's partially correct, but fundamentally flawed. Yes, I think Whitmore was involved in fraudulent schemes, and yes, I believe his wife was complicit, but I don't think he killed Hartwell." "Then who did?" "Someone with far more to lose than a mere swindler. Someone who understood the true value of Hartwell's services and couldn't afford to have them exposed." We had reached our lodgings when Holmes suddenly stopped, his attention caught by something in the shadows across the street. "Watson, we're being watched again. Different person this time, a woman in a dark cloak." I looked but saw nothing unusual. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain, and I believe I know who it is." Holmes smiled grimly. "Mrs. Blackwood has not gone home as she claimed. She's been following us, which suggests that her concern for her husband's whereabouts is not entirely genuine." "You think she's lying?" I think she's told us enough truth to gain our sympathy while concealing the most crucial facts. The question is, what is she really after? As we climbed the stairs to our rooms, I found myself wondering if we had stumbled into a case where everyone was guilty of something, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between the various deceits and determine who, if anyone, was truly innocent. Holmes seemed to read my thoughts. The complexity of modern crime, Watson, lies not in the methods employed, but in the multiplicity of motives. Everyone in this case has secrets to protect, making them all potential victims and potential perpetrators. But surely the truth will emerge? It will, but I fear it may be more disturbing than any of us anticipated. The disappearance of Edmund Hartwell has opened a door into a world of deception and false identities that reaches into the highest levels of society. Before this case is concluded, we may discover that the respectable facade of Victorian London conceals corruptions that would shock even the most cynical observer. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with the news that another message had arrived, this one hand-delivered by a street urchin who had vanished immediately afterward. Holmes examined the envelope with his usual care before opening it. "Most interesting," he murmured as he read. "It appears, Watson, that we have been invited to view the solution to our mystery. The writer claims to have both Edmund Hartwell and Sir Charles Blackwood in custody and offers to reveal their whereabouts in exchange for a private meeting." "Where?" "The abandoned warehouse district near the Thames. Midnight tonight. It's obviously a trap, undoubtedly, but it may also be our only chance to uncover the truth before more lives are lost." As the clock in the sitting room chimed 11, Holmes began his preparations for what might prove to be our most dangerous adventure yet. The case had taken on a momentum of its own, drawing us deeper into a web of deception that seemed to encompass everyone we had encountered. "Watson," Holmes said as he checked his revolver, "I have a feeling that tonight we shall finally meet the person who has been orchestrating these events from the shadows. The question is, will we survive the encounter to bring them to justice?" The fog had thickened as we made our way through the narrow streets toward the Thames, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap that had been carefully laid from the moment we first set foot in Hartwell's shop. The game was reaching its climax, but I feared the final moves might cost us everything. The warehouse district near the Thames at midnight was a landscape of shadows and menace. Fog rolled off the river in thick tendrils, muffling sound and distorting vision until the familiar city seemed transformed into something alien and threatening. Holmes and I made our way carefully through the maze of abandoned buildings, guided only by the cryptic directions in the mysterious message. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing to a narrow brick building whose windows had been boarded over. "Warehouse 7, just as specified." We approached cautiously, our footsteps echoing hollowly on the wet cobblestones. The building appeared deserted, but a faint light was visible through a crack in one of the boarded windows. Holmes tested the door. It swung open at his touch, revealing a narrow corridor that led deeper into the building. "Stay close, Watson," he murmured, drawing his revolver. "I have the distinct feeling we are expected." We advanced through the corridor, guided by the sound of voices coming from somewhere ahead. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of wooden crates and machinery, apparently abandoned for years. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson!" The voice came from the shadows ahead. "Please, come forward. You'll find us in the main chamber." We emerged into a large open space lit by several oil lamps. The scene that greeted us was like something from a nightmare. In the center of the room, 2 chairs had been placed facing each other. In one sat a man I recognized as Sir Charles Blackwood, his hands bound and his face bearing the marks of violence. In the other chair sat Edmund Hartwell, the missing tailor, also bound but apparently unharmed. "Gentlemen," called a voice from the shadows. "Welcome to the final act of our little drama." The speaker stepped into the light, and I gasped in recognition. It was Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, but transformed. Gone was the elegant lady we had met at the Criterion. In her place stood a woman whose eyes blazed with a terrible intensity, a revolver held steadily in her gloved hand. "Mrs. Blackwood," Holmes said calmly, "I confess I am not entirely surprised to find you here, though I admit I had not anticipated quite this scenario." She laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Of course you're not surprised, Mr. Holmes. You've been several steps ahead of everyone else from the beginning, haven't you? You knew the official story about Whitmore and his wife was fabricated." "Indeed I did. The timing was too convenient, the evidence too neat. But I confess I underestimated your own role in these proceedings." "My role," her voice hardened, "my role has been to clean up the mess that these two fools created with their pathetic schemes and their cowardly attempts to avoid responsibility." Sir Charles Blackwood raised his head with effort. "Victoria, please, you don't understand." "Don't I?" She turned the gun toward him. "I understand perfectly, Charles. You embezzled public funds, then compounded your crime by creating false identities to hide your thievery. And when that wasn't enough, you began blackmailing other clients of Mr. Hartwell's specialized services." Holmes stepped forward slightly. "So it was Sir Charles who was behind the blackmail letters?" "Oh, yes. My dear husband discovered that Mr. Hartwell kept detailed records of all his clients and their false identities. Charles saw an opportunity to recoup his losses by threatening to expose them unless they paid him substantial sums." Hartwell spoke for the first time, his voice hoarse. "I tried to stop him, Mr. Holmes. I told him that discretion was the foundation of my business, that betraying my clients would destroy everything I had built. But he threatened to expose me to the police if I didn't cooperate. And so you found yourself trapped between your professional ethics and your fear of prosecution," Holmes observed. "A difficult position indeed." "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," Hartwell continued. "I provided false identities to help people escape impossible situations, not to enable crime." Mrs. Blackwood's laughter was bitter. "How noble, and how convenient that your ethics didn't prevent you from charging enormous fees for your services." "But why reveal all this now?" I asked. "Why not simply disappear with your husband?" "Because," she said, turning to face me fully, "I discovered that Charles had been blackmailing more than just Hartwell's clients. He had been extorting money from me as well." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "From you?" "You see, gentlemen, I'm not actually Victoria Blackwood. I'm Charles's second wife, though he never bothered to divorce his first. The real Victoria Blackwood died in a carriage accident 5 years ago, and Charles saw an opportunity to assume her identity and inherit her considerable fortune." The full scope of the deception was becoming clear. "So you've been living as a dead woman," Holmes said. "Exactly. And Charles has been using that fact to control me, threatening to expose my false identity if I didn't support his increasingly desperate schemes. When I learned that he was blackmailing innocent people to pay for his mistakes, I realized that I had to act." "So you decided to eliminate both problems at once," Holmes said. "Frame your husband for murder while removing the evidence of your own crimes." "It was perfect. Charles would disappear, presumably having killed Hartwell to prevent exposure of his schemes. I would be free to assume yet another identity and disappear with what remained of the Blackwood fortune." Sir Charles struggled against his bonds. "You're insane, Victoria. You can't possibly believe you'll get away with this." "Can't I? Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson will unfortunately become victims of a tragic accident. The warehouse will catch fire, destroying all evidence of what actually occurred. The authorities will eventually conclude that Charles killed Hartwell and then himself, unable to face the shame of exposure. Holmes had been listening to this exchange with apparent calm, but I could see the subtle tension in his posture that indicated he was preparing to act. "An ingenious plan," he said conversationally, "but I fear you've made several critical errors in your reasoning." "Have I?" She kept the gun trained on us while reaching into her coat pocket with her free hand. "I can't imagine what they might be." "First, you assumed that Inspector Morrison's investigation into the Whitmore identity was genuine. In fact, it was a fabrication designed to draw attention away from the real crimes being committed." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Inspector Morrison doesn't exist, Mrs. Blackwood. Or rather, he exists, but he's not a police inspector. He's one of your accomplices, isn't he? Someone you hired to create the false narrative about Whitmore's criminal activities." For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. "You're guessing." "Am I? Then explain how a police inspector happened to be dining at the Criterion at precisely the moment we were meeting with you. Explain how he knew we were investigating the case when no one at Scotland Yard had informed him of our involvement." Second," Holmes continued, "you made the mistake of assuming that Hartwell kept physical records of his clients' identities. A man in his profession would never commit such information to paper. The records exist only in his memory, making him far too valuable to kill." Hartwell nodded weakly. "He's right. I never wrote down anything that could compromise my clients." "Third," Holmes said, taking a small step forward, "you underestimated the extent of my own investigation. I've known since this morning that Victoria Blackwood died 5 years ago. Her death certificate is on file at Somerset House, and her funeral was attended by several witnesses who are still alive. Then, I know that you are actually Margaret Ainsworth, formerly a lady's maid in the Blackwood household. You assisted Sir Charles in covering up his wife's death and assuming her identity, thinking you could control him through your knowledge of his crimes." Her face had gone pale, but she kept the gun steady. "It doesn't matter what you know. You won't live to tell anyone." "But I've already told someone," Holmes said calmly. "Inspector Lestrade is waiting outside with a full complement of constables. They've been there since we arrived." "You're lying." "Am I? Then explain the whistle you heard 5 minutes ago. That was my signal to Lestrade that we had uncovered the truth." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her features. In that moment of hesitation, Holmes struck. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from her hand as I rushed to untie the 2 prisoners. The struggle was brief, but violent. Margaret Ainsworth fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but Holmes's superior strength and training quickly overcame her resistance. Within moments, she lay unconscious on the warehouse floor. "Watson," Holmes said, breathing heavily, "please see to our prisoners while I signal Lestrade." As I freed Sir Charles and Hartwell, I couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of the deception we had unravelled. "Holmes," I said, "there's something I don't understand. How did you know about the whistle? I heard no signal." He smiled wearily. "Because there was no whistle, Watson, and Lestrade is not waiting outside. Sometimes the greatest weapon against a criminal is their own guilty conscience." "Then we're still in danger?" "Not at all. You see, I took the precaution of removing the bullets from Mrs. Ainsworth's revolver when I examined her coat at the Criterion. The weapon she's been threatening us with has been harmless all along." Sir Charles struggled to his feet, his face a mask of shame and relief. "Mr. Holmes, I owe you my life, but I want you to know that I never intended for anyone to be hurt. I was desperate, yes, but I'm not a murderer." "Your intentions are irrelevant, Sir Charles. You embezzled public funds, created false identities, and engaged in blackmail. Those are serious crimes that will require answers." "And what of Margaret?" Hartwell asked, gesturing toward the unconscious woman. She will face charges for kidnapping, attempted murder, and fraud. Her elaborate scheme to eliminate both of you while covering up her own crimes demonstrates a level of premeditation that will not be viewed favorably by the courts. As we prepared to leave the warehouse, Holmes turned to me with an expression of satisfaction. "Watson, this case has illustrated perfectly the danger of assuming that respectability guarantees virtue. The most elaborate crimes are often committed by those who appear most trustworthy. But how did you piece together the truth about Margaret's identity?" Several factors converged. First, the quality of her knowledge about the Blackwood family's affairs was too detailed for a mere wife. She knew things that only a household servant would know. Second, her emotional responses were wrong. She showed more concern for the family's reputation than for her husband's safety. Third, her movements yesterday were too precise, too calculated. She wasn't acting as a worried wife. She was executing a plan. And the business about the false identities? That was the key to everything. Hartwell's trade in new identities attracted clients who were already living lies. When desperate people are given the tools to become other people, the temptation to use those tools for increasingly serious crimes becomes irresistible. We had reached the street when Holmes suddenly stopped. "Watson, there's one more element to this case that we haven't addressed." "What's that?" "The question of what happened to the real Mrs. Blackwood. Margaret claimed she died in a carriage accident, but I suspect the truth is rather more sinister." "You think she was murdered?" "I think we should examine the circumstances of her death very carefully. If Margaret and Sir Charles were willing to go to such lengths to maintain their deception, it's possible that Mrs. Blackwood's death was not the accident it appeared to be." The implications of this revelation sent a chill through me. "Then, this case is far from over." "Indeed not, Watson. We have solved the mystery of the vanishing Tailor, but we may have uncovered evidence of a much older and more serious crime. The game, as they say, is afoot once again." As we walked back toward the centre of London, I reflected on the events of the past few days. What had begun as a simple case of mysterious disappearances had revealed a web of deception that reached into the highest levels of society. The respectable facade of Victorian London had been stripped away to reveal the corruption beneath. "Holmes," I said as we reached Baker Street, "do you think we'll ever reach the bottom of this affair?" "I suspect, Watson, that we have only begun to understand the true scope of the crimes involved. The business of false identities, blackmail, and murder has roots that may extend far deeper than we have yet imagined." He was right, of course. Over the following weeks, our investigation into the death of the original Victoria Blackwood would reveal connections to a network of criminals that operated at the highest levels of society. The case of the vanishing Tailor had opened a door into a world where identity was fluid, truth was negotiable, and murder was simply another tool of business. But that, as Holmes would say, is another story entirely. For now, it was enough that we had solved the mystery of Edmund Hartwell's disappearance and prevented Margaret Ainsworth from claiming any more victims. The fog was lifting from the Thames, and London was awakening to another day, a day in which justice, however complex its path, had ultimately prevailed. As Mrs. Hudson served us breakfast the next morning, Holmes looked up from his newspaper with the expression of quiet satisfaction. "Watson, I've been thinking about our recent adventure, and I believe it illustrates an important principle of detection." "What's that?" "The most dangerous criminals are not those who operate in the shadows, but those who hide their crimes behind a mask of respectability. The tailor's shop on Brewer Street was not just a business, it was a symbol of how easily the truth can be obscured by the appearance of legitimacy." I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. "To the truth, then, however well disguised it may be." "Indeed, Watson, to the truth, and to the certainty that no matter how elaborate the deception, logic and careful observation will eventually expose the reality beneath. Outside our window, London continued its eternal dance of commerce and intrigue, and I knew that somewhere in its maze of streets and secrets, other mysteries awaited our attention. But for now, we had earned our rest, secure in the knowledge that we had prevented a grave injustice and brought the guilty to account. The case of the vanishing tailor was closed, but the lessons it had taught us about the nature of identity, deception, and the darker impulses of human nature would remain with us always. In a world where appearances could be so easily manipulated, the pursuit of truth had become not just our profession, but our sacred duty, and thus concluded one of the most complex and dangerous cases in the long partnership between Sherlock Holmes and myself. It was a case that reminded us that in the great game of crime and detection, the most formidable opponents are often those who appear most innocent, and the greatest mysteries are sometimes hidden in plain sight.